Hi, it's Marcus here again, as you know full well, wearing one of my happy t-shirts. Thinking about optimism. Optimism is actually really important, especially in a time when so much negativity is being directed at our psychic beings, our minds, our way of seeing the world. We are being befuddled and sometimes directly attacked by negativity at large. What does that look like? Well, it looks like the consistent reporting on anything that's bad. It also is a kind of reporting that disempowers us, makes us feel like we have no agency, no voice. It's also reporting that often distorts the way our memories work, and of course that feeds into narrow, diminished, anorexic foresight, where the images of the future, thanks Fred Pollack, are somehow truncated, cut off, and dark. So all of that means that optimism is something that we really need to be committed to, but we need to be committed to it in a way that builds it and actually makes it a real tool for personal and collective, you might say, liberation, but it's probably better to say, using Foucault, being governed a little less. So this is, I'm going to flick to it now, this is a reflection on optimism, and I guess in some respects how to be optimistic, but I want to put it into context, because optimism is, especially if you've got a historical mind, has not always been in large supply. So the image I've got here, of course, is of the very recent No Kings marches across particularly the US, but it had resonances around the planet. And of course, what do they do? Well, they're saying no kings. Well, just like in 1772 when the Americans threw out the Brits and so on. Well, it wasn't, they started to throw out the Brits. It took them 4 years, and it's probably going to take them at least 4 years to deal with the current Trumpian MAGA dilemma that I guess more conscious people in the social orders that we inhabit are trying to deal with. But let's go back a little bit, okay? Let's go back to those good old Greeks. They were not particularly optimistic, they weren't optimists by and large. They knew how to have a laugh and a party and everything. And one of the great Greek tragedians, that's a person who writes stories, which would have been on, Netflix today, but back then they didn't have Netflix, but they had these wonderful amphitheaters, of course. Euripides wrote a play about the woman Medea, who was a sorceress, a really hot chick in her early days, totally bewitched Jason, who was a Greek hero, not a particularly nice hero in many respects, but she was able to bring about the breaking of Jason's heart, because she and he were married and then he decides to leave her. So what does she do to get back? She does what many people might do today. She kills all the kids, right? So at the end of the play, the very last lines of the play, Euripides has the chorus saying this: many other things Zeus of Olympus has in his keeping, and many things do the gods accomplish beyond men's hopes plural. What men expect does not happen, for the unexpected, this is key, finds a way, and so it has turned out today. So Euripides was reflecting on the bitterness of life, but also on the fickleness of people, particularly of men like Jason, who was so enamored of himself, so basically up himself in many respects, you might say, failed to see that his actions needed to be mediated with the awareness of their impact on others. For instance, Medea, his wife, who loved him, but then she went mad. She's shown often in images as a mad woman, a sorceress, because she was a sorceress. She had occult abilities and so on. And good old Euripides, in this little clip, image I've got here, that's a sculpture of him, he says, "It talks sense to a fool, and he calls you foolish." And I think that's very much a saying that might resonate with many of us today as we try and talk about climate change and somebody doesn't believe it or whatever else. Now, because I can't stay within the sort of European circuit, I'm going to jump across to India and look for a moment at the Bhagavad Gita, which saw life as a struggle between dark forces, unconscious forces, and conscious forces, consciousness, you might say, and unconsciousness at a metaphorical level. And, you know, the Gita is taken from the Mahabharata, which is the story of the great Indian nation back about 5,000-6,000 years ago. It's got a very interesting history itself as an ancient mythic structure about righteousness and wrongness and all the rest. Key to the Gita, because that's what we call it, Gita just means song actually, is the fact that as they're about to start a battle, Arjuna, one of the 5 brothers, freezes, and he can't bring himself to initiate the battle, which is going to lead to, if they are victorious, the destruction of many people from his own family, people that he loved and respected in actual fact. And Krishna has to sort of talk him round by reminding him, well, what's the real purpose of life here? And the purpose of life is to act and to bring about increased, you might say, well-being, increased justice, increased consciousness, and so on. So he says, let a man lift himself by his own self alone. Notice the self there is a capital self, S. Let him not lower himself, for this self is the friend of oneself. Sounds a bit like a kind of tongue twister. And this self alone is the enemy of oneself. What does he mean? Well, there are 2 selves at work in all of us. A self that is conscious. In the Indian sort of tradition, it's the divine self, it's the God spark within us. And there's the other self, the petty self, the self that can be lazy or fearful and shirk one's duties. So Krishna begins this kind of discourse where he, as charioteer for Arjuna, so Krishna's in blue and Arjuna, who's the king actually, is shown in reverence to Krishna. But Krishna is the charioteer. In other words, Krishna is the mind, the will that drives the chariot, and Arjuna is the one who acts. It's a very interesting weaving of metaphorical layers there. But my point in bringing this up now is that life is struggle and that we need to exert ourselves in order to foster our future's sense of optimism. So let's think about it. So we're working with these future senses, right? Memory. We are activating re-memory. It's liquid, it's open and permeable and entangled. Memory is not a linear chronicling of things. It's actually a living emotional engagement with our past, both our individual past, but also at a cultural level with our cultural pasts, plural. Okay, foresight drawing on that, it's about image, it's about vision, it's also about ethics and equity. And again, I'll put in the word entangled. Foresight is entangled with memory, but it's also entangled with our own biographies, where we are on this planet right now at this time, age, sex, entitlement in terms of, how wealthy are we or how not wealthy are we? Where are we in relation to powerful institutions and so on? And then, of course, we've spent quite a bit of time on voice. This is a critical spirituality sort of focus that we have here. It's about re-memory again, picking up on the word from the top there. Re-imagination, now playing with the image of the future from Pollack, but this time saying we reimagine or we re-image what's possible, and therefore we reconnect. So in the entanglement, we're also about reconnecting. And optimism is very much linked to that. So optimism grows out of a relational spirituality of collective action and being. In other words, you and I as individuals still behave collectively. We are always part of collectives, whether they are ecological collectives, cultural collectives, historical collectives, national collectives, institutional collectives, and so on. Optimism invites us, as Rob Hopkins has reminded us, and I've used Rob Hopkins quite a lot in this course, to fall in love with the future. And that's really important. So when we start turning towards the future sense of optimism, we are turning towards an affirming relationship, a strengthening relationship, an expansive relationship with life and the multiple futures before us. So at the collective level, as I said this with our front cover of this lecture, no thrones, no crowns, no kings, okay? So collectively we can go and march. And, you know, I turned to this guy, Parker Palmer, to think about this. And I started thinking about Parker Palmer this morning because I get his, I subscribe to his Substack, and he was talking about his going off to a No Thrones, No Crowns, No Kings session last weekend, and he was reflecting on it. Now, he's in his late 80s, okay, and I've been in love with Parker Palmer for decades now. I have his 1993 book, which I'll just lean over here, To Know As We Are Known. I have that on my shelf for a long time. I've shared it with many people. I've bought people copies, in fact, because it is one of the most beautifully written and thoughtful books that I would have to say I have on my shelf. And so I started thinking about Parker Palmer this morning because I got his Substack. I read it, and there's an image from it later on in this lecture. But, you know, I wanted to go back. It made me go back and grab that book off my shelf. And there are 3 slides now that I want to touch on, because it's about this personal mode, that optimism. It is a personal thing. We need to cultivate it individually as part of our sort of psychic structure, our world view, you might say, but it's also a world practice. It's not just a view, it's actually a practice. And key to that is, how do we understand truth? For Parker Palmer, truth is relational. It has a kind of emotional and spiritual, even one would say, because he is a Quaker. Quaker is a certain kind of Christian that values silence, is not doctrinal in the kind of, let's say, more conventional ways, and it's also not rushing us towards the end of times or something, as you might get from an evangelical Christian perspective. It, to me, is one of the most delightfully and attractive forms of Christianity that we can find, and he's a beautiful example of it. Quakers are pacifists, for a start. So I've got some things to think about here as we think about this relationality of truth. Parker says the following: here is a key characteristic of scholarship in the personal mode, the sense that we have been discovered and plumbed by the subject of the research itself. The truth is alive and active in the subject. That's the subject matter, but it's also in you and I. We are subjects, seeking us out even as we seek it. The truth, or the information you might get from, let's say, researching a historical question or doing surveys for futures research and strategic planning, anything like that, we have been fooled, I would say, by the way our objective scientific worldview functions in modernity, to thinking that the subject is passive. That means it's the objectivity, right, of our own particular gaze. That's the philosophical term. So we have a gaze. An objective gaze makes believe, from Parker Palmer's perspective, that the world that we are looking at, or the subject matter of our research, our scholarship, is passive, but it's not. We are engaged with it. Well, I read to you from Euripides. That means we're engaging with the thinking, the voice of a man who was writing 2,450 years ago. That's a long time. We are still actively seeking Euripides out as he seeks us out across time and space. He could no way have imagined that there would be people 2,500 years later, roughly, who knew his name, who could reference some of his plays and so on. It's an amazing thing that we have this ability. The same would be true of the people who wrote, and it's not one person, who wrote the Mahabharata, and from which the Bhagavad Gita arises. Again, 2,500, 3,000 years old, depending on which parts you're looking at. So let's move on to see what he's doing. So he's giving us this thing that the subject matter of scholarship creates us, or seeks us out, you might say, as we seek it. And there's a reason why I'm doing all of this to do with optimism, because we'll get there in a moment. He goes on, he says, same page or the page after, if we understand the person, that's you and me, as the most objective reality, that means our consciousness, because, why? Of the capacity for self-definition, I am me, and self-defense. Go away. That sort of thing. So this is the most objective reality, your subjectivity in your mind. It's your world. You are in control of that, maybe, or at least partially. The personal mode of knowing runs less risk than objectivism. That's what I was talking about, seeing this object of our study as passive, of diminishing reality to self-serving subjective terms. In a world devastated by objectification of everything, including ourselves, that means we objectify the natural world, we objectify people who are deemed other, whether they are people of a different ethnicity, different religious persuasions, different political persuasions, different genders, and so on, and we ourselves have been objectified in that world. Think Facebook, the objectification, tripping over my words here, of self on Facebook is very interesting. So in a world devastated by this kind of objectification of everything, including ourselves, this primitive way of personal knowing turns out to be quite advanced. Primitive is inverted commas there. Why is it primitive? It's primitive because it goes back to our own subjectivities as a basis for knowing, for truth making, I guess is the best way to put it. So what does this mean, and why am I talking about it? It's because freedom and optimism are linked together. So this is a process continuum, okay, between the objective and the subjective. So Parker Palmer argues the ideal that freedom is achieved through obedience to truth is also at the heart of liberal education, which is what he's really focusing on, whose aim is to liberate us through knowledge. Both our spiritual and our secular traditions affirm that truth will set us free, that only in obedience to truth can freedom be found. Of course, this makes me think, and maybe you too now, of Foucault and his definition of critique as being governed a little less. So for Parker Palmer then, the idea that freedom is achieved through obedience, okay, he's linking, therefore, we need structures, we need rules, we need ways of making sense of the world that are at some level verifiable, but also shareable. I've been working on these future senses lectures so that I can share some of those insights with you. How much of that can I transfer to you, as from mind to mind, one might say, but also how much of what I'm giving you can you then transfer into your own lives in your own way? I am not a person who's doctrinaire. I've never been one to believe that my way is the only way, but I'm also a person who recognizes that you come across a tool, CLA, future triangle, whatever that might be, and you put it to your own use. Okay, there is no arbiter out there that says you're wrong, you're using that the wrong way. My only way of testing wrong from right is how much harm does the application of some tool cause to people? How much harm does it cause to the planet? How much harm does it cause to our own internal intellectual structures to believe the kind of stuff that the MAGA people believe, for instance, is a sheer flouting of rationality. It damages our own intellectual structures, and it gives way to fear, negativity, meanness, narrowness, and all those other things, which are harmful both to the world around us, but also to ourselves. All right, so let's focus on this governed a little less from Foucault. The work of being governed less is a cause for optimism. Okay, so to be governed less is a cause, and it's to doing the work of being governed less, right? We redefine memory. How? It's the critical work of cultural renewal, such as no kings, no kings. Back to the American War of Independence. Energize foresight through plumbing memory, tradition, cultural resources. Okay, so the people who have started this No Kings campaign are plumbing memory and tradition and cultural resources with an idea of challenging the closing down of certain futures that don't suit the political and economic and ethnic agendas of the MAGA group, and obviously spiritual as well, in terms of, or religious at least, in trying to enforce a certain kind of Christianity on the bulk of the population. And also to be governed less is mobilizing our voice, the voice, through situating the building of alternatives and the sparking of resistance. Okay, so let's say no kings, it situates, this is in America, it situates the building of alternatives by suggesting and reminding people that, you know, the American people have before thrown off oppressive, dictatorial type behavior and assumptions about the way the world works, and have instituted much more democratic forms. And this sparks resistance. In other words, when we mobilize our voice, we are mobilizing resistance to being governed quite so much. So truthing, the verbal nature of optimism. I deliberately use this term truthing. It's of course not a real word at some level, but it has meaning, because truth is often seen as a noun, but truthing is a verbal reconstruction of that noun. We don't actually we don't use the term in English, but when you start thinking about becoming a little less governed, maybe we can also start playing with our use of language. So, one central aspect of optimism is the sense of engagement with our world, that we have a voice and that we engage with the world. We're not passive characters who are storied into the narrative, written into by others. We are co-creators. So as Parker Palmer points out, we are truth makers, with the implication being that we are also potentially lie makers. We can live a lie as well as we can live a truth, of course. And those lies and truths are embedded in the narratives we tell and the narratives we also accept from others. We are always in the process of truthing and lying. Interesting that lying, a lie, you can say that's a lie and that's truth, but you can say lying is something that you're doing, whereas truthing is something we don't say we're doing. That's an interesting reflection on the English language. Optimism, of course, aligns with truthing. So now I've got a slightly mixed up alphabet, BCA, not ABC, but B, we're building community. We're crafting purpose, that's the C, crafting, so building, crafting, and amplifying. We're going to amplify our voice. So the other day, what was it? It was on Friday. Last Friday, I went to a Death Cafe session. It was wonderful. And of course, this is about building community around things that matter. The Death Cafe, of course, is an attempt. It's a global attempt. It's not something that we just decided to do here on the Sunshine Coast. It's people are saying, look, we need to be able to talk about death, dying, bereavement, grief, the economic and social practices of death and dying. So what are we doing? In real time, we're sitting face to face and having a coffee and a cake and a chat. and we have a couple of people who guide with a few questions or activities. Okay, we're sitting with like-minded souls. We're in connection sometimes, especially if you do this Death Cafe work outside with the worms that might be composting you one day. We're in connection with the more than human. We're also in connection with people across time. In the Death Cafe, many of us were talking about our friends and relatives, even parents, who have gone before us into the great beyond. In other words, they've died. And of course, the other thing about sitting in community like that, of course we're building, but we're building from love. We are relating, connecting, and sustaining. So just as the No Kings movement was an action of building in real time, face to face, with like-minded souls who are all worried about where, in that case of the No Kings, where the American democracy is going and so on. And of course, many of the people there are also aware that the kind of climate denial and also basically attacks on science, scientific method, and in a sense even the rational, all have implications for the more than human. That time is being stripped away, that we're being forced to live in the present, which is dictated by, short-term news snaps and so on. And it's definitely a world that is diminished in love and so on. So then we can turn to crafting, and crafting is a verb. So there's a verb. So what are we doing? It's purpose. It's about perfect. We are crafting purpose, and that is a verb. We do it. We live purpose. Purpose is contextual, so it looks different. If you've got kids, one of the purposes we have is just to put food on the table and feed them, clean them, make sure that they are emotionally and intellectually safe, and so on. Purpose uses echolocation. In other words, and I'm using that word deliberately, echolocation, it's using a sense of, as you're going through life, working on your purpose, and of course we don't know our purpose absolutely in any sense, and it's one of the reasons I'm sure why many of you are in the course. Echolocation is about sending out messages into the surrounding world around us, and do we get affirmed, or is it denied, suppressed, and so on? Because what we will find, most of us find that we go through life sending out little echo beep, beep, beep type sounds, and what comes back to us will either draw us on into that particular activity. Should I be a teacher? Should I be a consultant? Should I just stay home and look after the kids and actually really make sure that they become strong and dynamic and fulfilled human beings? Is that enough? If that's enough, that is fine. If you still find that there's a hungry niggle, a kind of yearning for more, then you have to look at, well, how do we do the trade-off here? What's the win-win? And that's what I'm thinking of as echolocation. But also purpose has, a foundation in neurobiology. That purpose actually emits hormonal secretions in the body which are validating. When we have a sense of purpose, we actually have a sense of optimism, of course, but also possibly euphoria, excitement, and so on. So, and in that sense, and I've just been making some bread, so I thought of purpose is like yeast. It actually expands, enriches our world. It amplifies things, in other words. And so the main enemy of purpose is doubt. I don't believe that I'm good enough for this or whatever. And the other part of that, and that doubt, is whose story are we living? And that's key. So the enemies, I probably should have made that plural, is doubt, but also how do we reflect on the stories that we live? In what way can we engage with courage, with the messages we're getting from the world around us that can be inhibiting our purpose? And of course, if our purpose is inhibited, incredible impact on our optimism. And, basically it fosters pessimism if you don't have a sense that you're living your own story, that your own authority is being affirmed. So then the last point is the amplifying point, that those futures pheromones that I like to refer to are calling us. They are drawing us into life, but they are also warning us about futures that we don't want or might, see as inimical to human satisfaction, human well-being, but also to our own ability to fulfill our own purpose. There is relational amplification. In other words, when we do things together, when we are building, like I was referring to a couple of slides earlier, we are amplifying our sense of purpose, our sense of optimism. There's also spiritual amplification as we come to terms with voice and the depths of voice. What is how do we live our voice? Using the voice archetypes, psychosynthesis, warm data, all of those kinds of tools, they help us reflect on ourselves. Who are you, really? Who am I, this person who's a voice at the other end of this lecture thing? To me, these are questions that you just take for granted. Oh, that's Marcus talking, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but no. There is something else happening here, okay? And that something else has an amplifying effect. We are building a field of futures sensing, okay, in which the 5 futures senses that I'm focused on they mobilize action. They mobilize self-understanding. So doing more of what matters. And there are, and I've got a list of them coming up, practices that amplify. Now, we've talked about them a bit because we've covered them in voice. But now when we're thinking about optimism, we need to understand that we practice optimism. Optimism isn't something that just falls out of the sky and hits us on the head. It's something we must do. Okay? So personal practices of joy, for instance. We walking, dancing, planting. I love planting seeds at the moment. Singing, on my own, laughing on my own, or with people, experimenting, doing things that you might not do normally to see what happens. Dreaming and meditating, all of these are personal practices of joy. And they are accompanied by social practices. These are brains obviously emitting waves where we find one another or repel one another according to the kind of frequencies or the Wi-Fi ability of the brain. Okay, so social practices of joy, working with groups large and small. We can be playful or a bit, not completely deadly serious. If you're deadly serious, you're not going to get very far and you'll burn out. It needs to have some kind of joyful resonance there. I've written down the Jane Goodall factor. Jane Goodall, who died very recently, was an inspiration to everybody around her, but her own story is very interesting because she was drawn into a life of purpose. She was always curious as a kid, but then, certain incredibly fortuitous, one might say, events, but if you believe Euripides and the gods and what the gods get up to, you know that there might be other things working there. So the Jane Goodall factor is about the social practice of joy. She started and spearheaded different movements and so on, and also became a kind of, through inspiration, a person who shared purpose with others. Then there's this sense of solidarity that we are in it together, so showing up is really important. And of course there's this affirmative positivity. And when you're being called woke by somebody, take it as a compliment. There is that we are actually doing things that are affirmatively positive, or emit affirmative positivity. I like those. So these are practices, and of course these are the lists are just stuff that I pulled out of the air right now. So I have this little article called I'm Mushroom that's coming out. It's in press, that's why it's written down there like that. I used a bit of this paper last week, but I had to return to it yet again because it's going through the peer review process, and I thought I'm going to pull out some sections from here. Kat McNichol, she did the illustrations for this, and I wrote the paper. And you'll see one of Kat's great illustrations in a little moment or two, because she I can't not share one of those great illustrations with you. But I want to say this about optimism. Optimism is a key future sense. as it provides the energy needed to find our way out of the cage of the conditioned present. I think of optimism as soul food. Probably should have underlined that, shouldn't I? It allows me to shift focus and direct my wayfaring towards preferred futures. This is the sense that needs nurturing. It calls for a reframe of memory and foresight and voice, and it calls in mutuality. In other words, they're all in it together. This is not a demand, but a reciprocal calling. This is personal and deep. My entangled voice responds to the calls from the future. As an ancestor of these voices and calls, I am all ears. Listening beyond my finitude, I hear murmurations of things to come. My heart swells as I call back, I'm here, I love you. What else is there to say? Perhaps, I'm coming. So I approached this in this paper through the use of awareness and movement and calling. Awareness extends my sense-making, that's using the future's senses. Movement, embodied exploration leading from body data to body wisdom. And calling, life is calling, life into life. There is no escape. We must live our lives, whether they are anorexic and purposeless, or whether they are deeply uplifting lives. It's up to us, really. We have the choice. So awareness. Many of our attempts to engage the planetary crisis we have triggered by being successful as technological species have focused on fixing things, fixing the problem. The diagnostic tools of science and technology, economics, policy and governance all miss the point. They are unaware of the deep cultural fungal forces that shape consciousness. Don't forget that this is a paper called I Am Mushrooms, so the fungi act as a rich metaphor here. To be aware requires us to approach the fungal depths of consciousness. Through a range of future senses, we need a new aesthetics, one that helps us in our wayfaring, offering cartographic skills to map make in a way that does not reify the world around us. In other words, the objective stuff that Parker Palmer was talking about, but opens up to us in richness and mystery. Alongside that sits movement. It is easy to get lost in our heads. How often are we doing that, eh? Much of our speculative and imaginative work is corralled by language, right? And domesticated by a lifetime of disciplining the body to be submissive to the mind and to social systems. Education and industrial work both condition us in this way. I use movement and play to challenge this conditioning. So movement is key. The results are always remarkable. And then here's this beautiful image from Kat McNichol. This is the future's pheromone. Time calls to us. The future also calls to us. In our mycorrhizal world, everything is alive. From this perspective, we can understand calling as pheromonal. Pheromones, what do? Well, they are communicative chemical messages. When we dance, move, play, we are not just releasing hormones in our bodies, we are also producing collective expressions as pheromones. But beyond that, we can understand the fungal world of culture as also producing pheromones. These can attract but also repel. I argue that environmental futures, which is the issue that this is going into, this particular paper, that environmental futures work involves futures pheromones, which is this image here. Okay, so what do? Well, we jump to Euripides again. So we have Euripides. To the Greeks, or at least one of them, being Euripides, he says this: a pleasant thing to me is dancing. Aha. When the flute's clear notes charm the ear and songs are heard. Pleasant too is Aphrodite, the goddess of love, when in gracious vein. Only when in gracious vein. When she's being horrible, she's in absolute horror. And to see prosperity smile on friends hitherto unblessed. That too is cause for joy. This is key. Manifold is the offspring of fate, giver of fulfillment and of time, son of creation. So the fatalism of the Greeks comes through again, but they situate it within temporality. And he links that temporality or time to creation. Getting very close to the end now. So when we're studying the future, what are we doing? Well, if we think about Parker Palmer, okay, we know that our study of the future creates the future, that we and the future, our object of studies, are self-referential. Every act of inquiry leads to self-discovery. We live, as Fred Pollack told us, an inner story that is set in the material world, the outer story. The Gita teaches that purpose is a human calling and that we need to fulfill it through action in the field of struggle. I've put the word Kurukshetra there because that's the battlefield on which Krishna and Arjuna had their discussion. Or Krishna told Arjuna how to get active in the world and do what was right. Euripides reminds us that fate is inexorable, but we walk it, okay? Optimism, as the sort of focus of this lecture, optimism is a tool for resistance as pessimism closes down alternatives. It is, pessimism, entropic. It leaks energy. And Palmer reminds us that all knowing is metaphorical. And I think that is a beautiful reminder that all knowing is metaphorical. When we say chair, when we say tree, we're using a language cues that represent something, but the something is never, the word is never the thing, but we often in our language systems forget that. Final slide is a lovely poem from Wendell Berry, and he's talking about how to be a poet. And I really think that in my world at least, the optimism and poetry, creativity, they are doorways or portals to other places and to wonder. So I'm going to read a little bit, but I'm not going to read the whole poem to you. I'm just going to read you the opening part. Make a place to sit down. Sit down. Be quiet. You must depend upon affection, reading, knowledge, skill. More of each. That's what we need, okay? Then you have inspiration too, okay? Work, growing older, patience for patience. Joins time to eternity. Any readers who like your work, it might be you guys listening to my lecture now, doubt their judgment. You might think you're all going mad. What's this guy on about, you might be saying. And it's a very good question to be sort of wondering whether you are being fed a load of crop. I hope not. I don't really think that. So, but, the point that Wendell Berry's making is that a poet, somebody who imagines alternatives, plays with language and metaphor, meditates deeply upon things, and then tries to share in some small way through a few lines or a few words, an image, a metaphor, some insight into reality that may touch the heart of someone else, helping them perhaps get over some great depression, some wound, some trauma. Perhaps it just brings a laugh and a smile. That's always my hope as well. Anyway, I hope this lecture has been helpful, and we'll look a little bit more at, the kind of practices and activities that I think might lead to a strengthened future sense of optimism. Catch you then. Bye-bye.